Good morning, my name is Philippa Hedley Takhar and I'm here to shed some light on what we mean by the National Institute for Health Research, the NIHR, and particularly focusing in on the MedTech and in vitro diagnostic cooperatives, the MICs. So hopefully a little bit of an overview this morning. So what is the NIHR? Essentially, it's that research arm of the NHS. It's the UK's largest funder of health and social care research. And so it's investing in that infrastructure, the facilities, the people, the technology, the buildings, to be able to, for clinicians, for universities to participate in research with industry and patient and public involvement. It's primarily funded by the Department of Health and Social Care with a budget of about £1 billion. And 2/3 of that is going into that infrastructure. And it's important to understand that this is very much a virtual organisation. So it's got a number of centres, units, departments that are funded by the NIHR to fundamentally develop different parts of that innovation journey, that different parts of the innovation pathway. So it's always very complex to access an organisation like that, but hopefully there are ways and means to kind of do that effectively to bring business value. A key part of what the NIHR does is to support that collaboration between different NIHR-funded organisations, to very much think about that translational piece. So it's looking at from bench to bedside. It's about taking discovery, experimental medicine and science, and moving it into products, devices, processes, treatments that are going to mean something to patients in the system. And the NIHR is very much working to support policy, economic benefit, industry, and again, that patient benefit. And it is the most integrated clinical research system in the world, and this is where we are kind of having that impact on economic growth as well as the health benefits. So, complex NHS, very big system, and complex research infrastructure, basically. So, and I think small companies particularly could find they have limited capacity or ability to find their way in and find those kind of key opinion leaders, investigators, the patient groups that you need to be in front of to understand what the product or service that's under development and how to get that input. So the NIHR offers a signposting service free of charge. That's the website address on there to kind of access that. I think it's very important, even though when we have signposting services, to really have a clear idea about kind of the direction or the support or the service that the industry needs. So giving something to the people doing that kind of triage is always beneficial, so they can point you in the right direction. Nobody wants to be sort of moving around the system trying to find their home and that niche area of support. So having that kind of clear idea, not only about the product or what you have to offer, but clearly what support you envisage needing in the next stage of that journey. So I'm just going to quickly talk through three areas of NIHR support in terms of that access to expertise, support for trials, and thinking a bit about funding as well. So I was going to draw your attention really, so when we know innovation isn't linear, we know it's not a straight line and we'll go on every sort of step of the journey and there we are at the end. We know it's more complex than this, but this is a helpful way, I think, really for support infrastructure and companies to figure out where you are on that journey and able to at least start having the dialogue about where support would best be placed. So I often use the technology readiness levels system when I'm talking about things, TRLs. I don't know if everybody's sort of comfortable with that. I think it's emerged more from the aerospace sector, but it's very much been picked up within other sectors. And what I was going to draw your attention to was thinking really about that self-analysis, that self-diagnosis of where a company and a product or service is. And understanding that helps understand where in the infrastructure you need to kind of access that support. So very much from that unmet need bit at this starting point, that light bulb moment, that I've had a bit of an idea, through to kind of understanding the evidence requirements, moving through evaluation, moving through development, health economics in terms of route to market. So the NIHR activity that I want to talk about really today is more about this stage here, from that unmet need, that concept, that new idea, taking that through those early stages to catalyse that and move it quicker through that long journey into this evaluation space. But of course, there will be a number of ways that we in our MedTech Cooperative network could then link into these other agencies. So some of this experimental medicine activity in the biomedical research centres and experimental cancer medicine centres, the applied activity again, so this is where you're talking about that translation of applied research, thinking about how we connect into the trials networks for evidence and evaluation, access to sort of data sources to sort of test product activity, and thinking about how you then transition into working with the agencies that move you over the line into commercialisation, so having the regulatory support, etc. So, the MedTech and in vitro diagnostic cooperatives, who are they and what are they? So we are a network of 11 based nationally, and don't get too hung up on the physical location of them. Really, we're about different themes, different thematic focus. And we do signpost and work together, so you could end up working with more than one MedTech cooperative. But it is important to note that we do have, in terms of a geography up here in the north, we do have a cluster here of our colleagues in Newcastle, Leeds, and my organisation is based in Sheffield. But we do work very closely on that national basis. And it's about those early kind of technology readiness level stages. It's about unmet need, validating those unmet needs and catalysing that activity through to pre-market activity and evaluating and bringing together a collaborative approach around that. So thinking about what you'd need from patient networks, clinicians, key opinion leaders, different industry partners, thinking about joint ventures, thinking about what you need to kind of move something along from A to B. And very crucially hosted by NHS organisations. So being at the heart of activity, understanding care pathways and the kind of resource and thinking that's going to need to be involved in taking something through from those early stages. And it's so very much important to realise that we aren't competitive, we are thematic, and therefore there's nothing in terms of competing to kind of do next stage activity. This is a busy slide. There's a lot of activity in this network. I think the important thing to understand is, along the side there, those are the 11 MedTech MIC thematic focuses, but they're very broad. You've got brain injury, cardiovascular, children and young people. You've got 4 that have focused on in vitro diagnostics, but very different in terms of the thematic activity within that. Devices for Dignity, which is my organisation, we focus on long-term conditions or multiple long-term conditions. So hence the name, very, very, explicit, Devices for Dignity and Independence. And then we've got mental health, surgical and trauma management. So within here is a list of those subclinical and enabling themes that we have within those institutions. And I think sometimes it is also worth perhaps approaching the organisation if you feel you're within that broader theme, but don't see it quite specifically in that sub-theme activity. It's worth just asking and sort of inquiring, is this something which would come under the boundaries, the auspices of that particular team's activity. The reason why we're focusing on those themes is to have that real targeted attention, that real understanding of the pathway, of the players, of what else is going on in that space right now, because we're keen to see stuff that's novel, that's a bit exciting, that's not been done elsewhere. We are publicly funded. We have to make sure that value to the public purse is we're doing something, we're catalysing, we're bringing value into accelerating product activity and along that innovation journey for patient benefit. In terms of what the MICs do, and this is quite hard to put on a slide, to be honest, because it is very bespoke. It'll be dependent on what the project is, what's already been done, what's needed to move it along the next stage of the journey. And as I've said, we're not particularly linear in what we do. So it may be there's been some early stage unmet need, concept validation activity, but clearly patient and public involvement is very key to a lot of what we do, particularly with my organisation in terms of very patient-facing devices. So that kind of activity will happen all along that journey. Thinking early on about the regulatory requirements, technical files, what's going to need to be put in place, thinking about design, thinking about materials. It's hard to say this is our kind of menu of services because it will depend on the project. But I think fundamentally this does capture a lot of those key areas which we add value to the wider system. So evaluations, pilot studies, trials, access to data, usability testing, concept. Human factors is an interesting area of focus as well in terms of what we're understanding more and more about behaviour and how people feel about technology and use of technology and our reactions to it, and a lot more activity going into that. So moving from that kind of theory and hypothesis of how someone's going to use something to something really more about that in practice, what does that look like? So some of that movement now to do more in that real world evidence space rather than always RCT trials, to understand how people react and use in some of these new pathways that are emerging and some of this transition from hospital and secondary care focus to using technology in primary care or community or the home environment. And we're also very good as a network because we're part of this host family, the NIHR, in terms of going for those grant applications, for going for funding, in terms of being part of that wider network and having that expertise and understanding what the funders are seeking in terms of funding research and innovation activity. And I would say as well, those access to multidisciplinary stakeholders and collaborators, by being part of this virtual organisation and part of the bigger system, there's that ability to kind of move around and access activity and support. So we're quite new, really, or some of us are. This really started in 2018, and we've been quite quick off the blocks across the 11 in terms of the number of research projects, the number of SMEs that have been supported, the number of patients recruited to studies, and the amount of funding achieved through I4I, which is a particular NIHR funding pot. So, you know, we are there to sort of move things forward. We are about action, we are about delivery. And I quickly, because I've not got much long left, I wanted to quickly touch on something about the Clinical Research Network, which is part of that NIHR family. A number of inquiries that I get in terms of support from our organisations, very much interested in perhaps it's been developed in the UK or overseas, and they're really trying to now prove and demonstrate and trial and evidence for the next stage activity. So I do want to recommend the resource of the Clinical Research Network and their study support service, which helps set up, regardless of location, study type, technology type, therapy, research area, a fantastic resource to understand how on earth you go about accessing that infrastructure and the networks. And finally, again, landscape's very complicated in terms of the NHS, and funding is no different. So again, it's very important to think about how you're going to fund the work with the mix. We do require funding. We have basic money for our infrastructure, but we do require funding to kind of do that activity with our partners. So that could come through grants, through co-applications, through doing work packages or commercial contracts. But we have had, as I said, a lot of success in achieving this kind of funding to take you over that valley of death where you've got perhaps a basic concept and moving to next stage activity in terms of sort of de-risking for later stage investment. So we are very good at partnering on funding bids to bring that investment in to move things along the journey. But it is worth having a good look through some of these opportunities to fund different parts of the development pathway. Thank you very much.